people disagree about whether, conceptually speaking, discrimination requires a comparator or not. People disagree about, as we talked about, what makes discrimination wrongful. Some people are monists, other people are not. But among pluralists, there are different accounts of what are the wrongful making features of discrimination. And I suspect that 50 years from now, we are probably in a similar situation.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Kasper Lippert-Rasmussen. He is a professor in political theory at the University of Aarhus in Denmark, and his work is focused primarily on applied and normative ethical issues. His books include, among others, Deontology, Responsibility and Equality, Born Free and Equal, Philosophical Inquiry into the Nature of Discrimination, Luck, Egalitarianism, Making Sense of Affirmative Action, and Wrongful Discrimination. This last book, published with Cambridge Elements, will be our focus for today. But yeah, feel free to add anything. But with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Lippert-Rasmussen.
Thank you so much.
So as I said in the introduction, we're going to focus on your recent element published with Cambridge Elements. I'll include links to where people can find it. And it's called Wrongful Discrimination. And so just to get into that, I think maybe we should start by thinking about what discrimination is first. So yeah, just sort of to start, like how do you approach that, or thinking about what discrimination is?
So my take on it is that when people use the term discrimination, they actually might have quite different things in mind. So there's a generic sense of discrimination where to discriminate is simply to differentiate. So at least I think you can make this point that not differentiating is not discrimination, but simply differentiating is perhaps discrimination in a very generic sense, but it's not the sort of thing that people have in mind when they complain about discrimination, because that would imply that all sorts of unproblematic ways of treating people differently would count as objectionable discrimination. So if the judge lets the innocent person free and convicts the guilty person, then that would be a way of differentiating between innocent and guilty, but it would not be a way of discriminating against people, in this case, the guilty defendants, in a way that people have in mind when they complain about discrimination. So as I see it, the task for the philosopher is to stipulate some additional conditions which treating people differentially have to meet in order for it to count as discrimination. And there are various candidates here. So one candidate in the literature is to say that if you differentiate people on irrelevant grounds, then that counts as discrimination. Others might say that something counts as discrimination if it involves treating people differently on the basis of features which, morally speaking, you ought not treat people differentially on the basis of. And then a third suggestion is that to discriminate against people is to treat some people disadvantageously on the basis of their group membership, where group membership is not, a group here is not just any arbitrary collection of people. It's membership of a group such that perceived membership of that group makes a significant difference to social interactions across a wide range of different social contexts. So say once being a member of the group of women would be a membership of a socially salient group in this sense, but being a member of the group of people who are born on a Tuesday would not be a socially salient group in this sense, because whether you're born on a Tuesday or whether you're perceived to be born on a Tuesday or not doesn't make any difference to how people interact with you in, I guess, except for a few isolated social settings. So these are three different candidates. and there are advantages and disadvantages of all three of them. In wrongful discrimination, like in other work, I suggest that for certain purposes, it's beneficial to go for the understanding of discrimination as a matter of treating people differentially on the basis of social group membership. And one advantage of this view is that it aligns well with a lot of different uses of the term discrimination. So I think basically all candidates for groups that are subjected to discrimination are groups that are socially salient groups, with the possible exception of genetic discrimination, where people are charged higher insurance premiums on the basis of genetic tests, where these genetic tests indicate that these people suffer some kind of heightened risk of developing certain diseases. And I think there are drawbacks of the two other conditions I mentioned. So one drawback of the irrelevant suggestion is that it gives rise immediately to the question of what makes a property relevant. And then you're easily pushed in the direction of giving some kind of moralized account of what makes a property relevant. And then essentially you've moved from the irrelevance account to the moralized account. And in relation to the moralized account, there's the problem that you can easily imagine cases where people are treated differentially based on properties which morally they ought not be treated on the basis of, but where people would be disinclined to say that this is a case of discrimination. So, for instance, if I treat members of my family better than non-members when I hire someone at my university, insofar as I have inner influence on whoever gets hired, most people would say that that would be a case of wrongful nepotism, but they wouldn't say that it is for that reason a case of wrongful discrimination. So, I mean, there are other suggestions out there, but these are three different ways to go when we want to, so to speak, narrow down or identify the subspecies of the generic discrimination that it might be interesting to look at for the purpose of discrimination theory.
Yeah, so very good. There's a bunch of things I wanted to go get to from there. So just as a first quick remark, I mean, you mentioned that for the irrelevant trait account, it might look like once you try to spell out what makes something an irrelevant feature, that might push you towards a moralized account. I was thinking it could also push you towards like a group account where the relevant trait has to do with maybe the socially salient feature, something like that. But it's not clear that regardless that is a sort of distinct option that sort of stands on its own, if that makes sense. Would you agree? Or
yeah, that's probably a better way to formulate this particular weakness of the irrelevance account. That what I mentioned was, so to speak, one way in which this account is pushed in a way which really reduces it to a different account, and the other way you suggest is, I mean, another way in which this pressure exerts itself. I think it might be worthwhile mentioning the additional weakness of the irrelevance account, that, I mean, certain instances of what I would think many people would think of paradigmatic cases of wrongful discrimination is actually a case where people are treated differentially based on a feature which many people would say is relevant. So take the case of reaction qualifications. So for some reason involving, I don't know, sexist bias, customers prefer to have a male bank advisor to a female bank advisor. And most people would think that it's a relevant consideration for a bank to consider how much they will earn from hiring a certain applicant for a job. And now they have a choice between this male and this female applicant. The female applicant is in many ways better qualified. She has higher marks from in her economics degree than the male applicant. But it's just that the bank knows that because of the sexist bias of the customers, they will be less inclined to be happy with having the female bank advisor than the male bank advisor. So it might be a relevant consideration, speaking in favor of actually hiring the less qualified male applicant in this case. But it's also something that many people would consider wrongful discrimination, at least insofar as the economic loss that the bank has to bear in order to not hire on the basis of customers' sexist biases. Insofar as these costs are not huge, then perhaps the bank ought to hire the best qualified applicant, who's in this case the female applicant. But if you go for the irrelevance account, you can't say that this is discrimination, gender discrimination.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So it seems like there's still other cases that we want to count as discrimination, but this sort of account wouldn't count as such. Good. And then, yeah, a couple of things just on the first remarks. Sort of important issue for me when thinking about these things is I try to frame the project, and you sort of did that a bit already, where you said, look, when terms like discrimination are used in everyday discourse, it gets used in messy and somewhat variable ways, and part of the job of the philosopher is to sort of develop from that. But would you describe this, what you're doing here when theorizing or offering a definition for discrimination, as a sort of precisification or conceptual engineering, or how would you describe what that sort of semantic thing is? What's going on there, and why do you know what I'm saying? What do you think about
that? That's a really excellent question, which I haven't given enough thought to. I think by inclination, I think of much of what I do as a matter of conceptual analysis from the armchair. I think probably discrimination is a bit tricky concept in this context because, it's, or at least the use of the term discrimination has evolved historically, and more cases of differential treatment that people say wouldn't have considered or described using the term discrimination 30, 40 years ago now are easily described in this way. So I think in the early 60s, for instance, people wouldn't talk of disadvantageous treatment of disabled people as a matter of discrimination. I think nowadays most people would do that. So probably there's been a change in the way in which we use the term discrimination. So so to speak, the traditional project of analytical conceptual analysis might be difficult in the sense that there's a constant evolution in our use of the relevant target term, and also whether or not there's evolution. Some of these issues are also very politicized, so it's not as if there is a truth about folks' use of the term discrimination. Different folks use the term differently. So it might, for instance, be that people who are often subjected to discrimination tend to be more inclined to describe cases of differential treatment as cases of discrimination than people who rarely are subjected to discrimination themselves. So as an aside, I've actually tried to study this empirically in relation to, so to speak, the comparator condition. So the idea being that it's a conceptual truth about our concept of discrimination that in order for you to be discriminated against, there has to be a comparator, either an actual person or a hypothetical person with a different identity from yours, who would have been treated or was treated better. So we designed various vignettes to test whether people would actually be more inclined to use the term discrimination when there was a comparator present than when there was not. The idea being that if the respondents were competent language users, if there was no comparator present in the vignette, they should be less inclined to say that there was discrimination going on than when we were talking about one of those vignettes where there was a comparator present. And the results we got was really quite mixed. It's difficult to test people's what concepts people employ, but it seems as if people are just using the term discrimination differently. And one thing we noticed was that there's a gender difference. So generally, we found that women are more inclined to use the term discrimination than men are. So while much of what I've been doing in my work on discrimination is conceptual analysis, I've come to think that perhaps there are limits to this approach. Explication might be a different way of thinking about some of what we're doing. And I guess I mentioned genetic discrimination as a sort of problem case for the group-focused account of discrimination, because people who are genetically discriminated against typically do not form socially salient groups. But nevertheless, it seems like now it's quite common to use the term genetic discrimination. So one could try to say that this is part of conceptual explication, that we might think that the reason why we are interested in discrimination is that there are certain kinds of harms involved in discrimination, which are not the sort of harms that arise in the case of genetic discrimination. So if for instance, we think that the harm involved in discrimination, which is more problematic, is something like subordinating certain groups of people, then on the assumption that, say, yes, a particular genetic a particular gene that codes you for a higher risk of a certain disease does not involve any risk of certain groups of people being subordinated, because those people will be typically people from all sorts of different socially salient groups, then you might think that it's okay to explicate the concept of discrimination in such a way that it doesn't fit that particular use of the term discrimination. And then, of course, there's also, as you say, conceptual engineering. So we could ask, but this is how we use the term discrimination, but how should we use the term discrimination? I mean, to my mind, that's a really tough question, in the sense that it would, I think, in order to give a fully satisfactory answer to that question, we would have to know a lot of empirical facts about how different uses of the term discrimination would affect, justice relevant facts in society. And of course, we would also have to answer questions about what would justice require. So while I think in many ways that's an interesting approach, I also think that this would be a very demanding approach to take to this issue about how we should use the term discrimination.
Yeah, fair enough. More could be said on this, of course, but I do want to cover a lot of other things, so I think I'll move on. Now, I do like at least broadly, the kind of group discrimination-based account. One potential worry I had, though, was for when you talk about socially salient groups, like as with the case of the genetic discrimination, it seems like there might be others where, well, it just looks like the account is too narrow. So, like, I don't know, maybe could people be discriminated based on like their hair color or other things that maybe don't form socially salient groups seems plausible. I mean, what do you think about things like that, where people could be discriminated based on pretty much anything, but we would still call that discrimination? Or maybe we would. I don't know. Maybe you disagree.
So hair color is perhaps not sufficiently idiosyncratic in the sense that, there's a correlation between hair color and race. There's also a correlation between hair color and age. And most people would allow that there's such thing as racial discrimination and age discrimination. So perhaps we're, for that reason, more inclined to allow that there is such a thing as discrimination on the basis of hair color. But perhaps, if we're talking about discrimination on the basis of hair differences in hair color, which are unrelated to any differences between socially salient groups, so I don't know, an employer who idiosyncratically prefers red-haired people to brown-haired people. So presumably there's no reason to believe that there'll be any racial differences or age differences between red-haired or brown-haired people. I think, if somebody were to voice that complaint using the term discrimination, I think I would say that, true, this employer is treating you unfairly, but at least this employer didn't engage in discrimination. In other than this very generic sense, where to discriminate is simply to treat people differently on the basis of some trait or other. So I wouldn't worry more about this case than, say, an employer who refuses to hire someone who's born on a Tuesday. And at least it seems to me that this kind of employer wouldn't be a societal problem that this kind of employer exists. It would be different, of course, if this employer started persuading other employers to refuse to hire, I don't know, brown-haired people rather than red-haired people, such that many employers started engaging in that practice. But then, of course, along the way, whether you have brown hair or red hair becomes a more socially salient trait.
Yeah. I guess that's fair. Maybe I just have in mind something more like that broad sense of discrimination than the actual target here, which is something more tied to. Well, you can think of the paradigmatic cases like race and gender and so on, and things like hair color. At least, given the way society actually is, don't only act like that. I guess that's fair. I don't know. Could think about that more though.
I guess if we were to allow that an employer who refuses to hire someone who's born on a Tuesday is an employer who discriminates and therefore is subjected to the same kind of regulations as an employer who refuses to hire on the basis of race or gender, for instance, I think we lose something in the sense that there is a moral issue involved in gender and race discrimination, which simply doesn't arise in the case of the employer who refuses to hire someone who's born on a Tuesday. It might be that, or it is the case that the employer who refuses to hire someone who's born on a Tuesday engages in unfair differential treatment of different applicants. But it just seems that this shows that the moral problem involved in discrimination must be a different one from simply treating people unfairly.
That's a good point. Actually, I was going to ask how this might connect with like legal and regulatory issues, like because you might think that, well, we could have some legal or regulatory sense of discrimination, and that might not be exactly what is being targeted or developed here. Whatever we have in the law, that that might be something, and whatever they count as discrimination, maybe. In the book you talk about protected groups and so on, and legal senses of discrimination based on that. But that's not. I mean, that just might be different from the sense of discrimination that you're targeting. So what would be the connection there, do you think?
Yeah, that's an important point. So I think for some concepts like, say, responsibility, you also have a legal sense of responsibility, but it just seems like the folk notion of responsibility is, while it might be in some ways affected by our legal notion of responsibility, it has evolved more or less independently of whatever the law says about responsibility, except I would imagine from some marginal features of the folk concept of responsibility. But it might be different with our folk concept of discrimination in the sense that it's much more influenced by legal regulation of discrimination. So there might be a tighter connection between how the laws regard or what, according to the law, is defined as discrimination and what, according to folks, count as discrimination. But I would still think that the folk notion of discrimination has considerable autonomy relative to legal notions of discrimination. And I think that comes up in cases where, say, historically, there hasn't been legal protection against a certain kind of discrimination. That might be discrimination against disabled people. So until the Disability Act in the US, it wouldn't count as discrimination to refuse to hire an applicant on the basis of this person being disabled. That changed with the law. But of course, in this case, the law was trailing a development in how folks saw differential treatment on the basis of disability. So at least I think it's insofar as we talk about causal effects, it's a two-way road, in the sense that sometimes developments in what folk consider discrimination affects what, according to the law, will be defined as discrimination. I don't know if that was the sort of thing you were alluding to.
No, that's good. I do sort of in a related thought. I was wondering, actually, also based on something you said earlier about empirical research. To what degree? Like, I often think about how this might be thought of, like, cross-culturally or in different languages or in different areas of the world. Like, I mean, you mentioned also at different times in history. Do you think any of that's relevant here, or especially like the cross-cultural stuff, or is it not really a focus, or at least not some part of the current investigation, do you think? Or what do you think about that?
I think it definitely would be a worthwhile project to explore this cross-culturally. I haven't been engaged in that myself, but and I would imagine that you could identify quite large differences in terms of the extent to which different kinds of differential treatment are labeled discrimination, or whatever is a relevant term in different cultures or countries across the world.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. And then I often like to ask questions about, so when you talk about socially salient groups, that to me seems like it's not, like, there could be cases where it's not clear whether something counts as a socially salient group. So there's like issues of vagueness here. So would you agree to that maybe there's, well, first of all, it might sort of come in degrees whether something counts as discrimination based on how salient the group is. And second, that it might be sort of indeterminate whether something counts as a socially salient group. And so whether it counts as discrimination in that sense. What do you think of that?
So I think I would agree with both points you suggest. So first of all, if you say that a group is socially salient to the degree that perceived membership of the group makes a significant difference to social interactions in a wide range of contexts, I think that there's a notion significant difference. You can ask how significant, and of course that's a scalar notion. and you can ask in a wide range of social context what counts as a wide range as opposed to a narrow range. And again, that's a scalar issue as well. So there are at least two different components of the notion of socially salience, which are scalar notions, and it would seem weird to expect that there's some kind of clear cutoff point or some clear combination of significance and the number of social contexts in which perceived membership makes a difference. So I'm definitely on board with saying that social salience is a scalar notion. It might be at the extremes. We can say that, I mean, being born on a Tuesday, that's an extreme in the sense that being a member of the group of people who are born on a Tuesday does not count as a socially salient group. And then one's gender in most societies would be at the other end of the extreme in the sense that it makes a significant difference to a lot of social interactions, which gender you have. But then, of course, between those two extremes, there's a lot of intermediate traits, so to speak, and the question: when does a group become sufficiently socially salient to count as differential treatment of that group counting as discrimination? Might have, no determinate answer. So I agree on your second point as well, that in some cases it's just indeterminate whether something is discrimination or not. And I think that's also actually reflected in some of the debates. So if you consider the idea that smokers are subjected to discrimination, I think if you said that in the early days of the civil rights movement, people would probably think that that this was a crazy suggestion. I think now things might be different in the sense that being perceived to be a smoker has become socially more salient than it probably was in the 60s, in the sense that for many people there's a lot of stigma attached to being a smoker, which means that being a smoker will, for some people, be associated with probably also having a lot of other traits, say traits regarding how disciplined you are as a person, or whether you are a short-termist or long-termist, which makes a difference to how you will interact with these people in other contexts. But then, of course, it's still, perhaps being a smoker is nothing like what race you have or what gender you have. So perhaps it's in this intermediate between those two extremes where it's just indeterminate whether this is discrimination or not. And probably that's reflected in the fact that when people in a wider public discuss whether certain, say, whether it's discrimination against smokers to refuse to hire a doctor at a lung cancer section at a hospital, whether that's discrimination or not, people tend to be much less inclined to agree than when they discuss cases of refusing to hire someone on the basis of their race or gender. And that might simply reflect this indeterminacy.
Yeah, that seems all pretty fair. Where do you think on the scale something like a differential treatment based on somebody's political beliefs, like where do you think that would definitely count, or is it like somewhere more in the middle, or what do you think?
That's something that might vary from country to country. My impression is that in the US at the moment, political views is actually whether you're perceived to be a Republican or a Democrat makes you a member of a highly socially salient group, in the sense that it will structure a lot of social interactions very significantly if you're perceived to be a member of the opposing political group. Whereas perhaps in other countries, or perhaps in the US in the 70s or whatever, that wasn't in the same way something that structured people's social interactions in the same very significant way as it does now. I think looks is another thing which is interesting in this sense, because uh, whether you're perceived to be beautiful or not is actually, it makes a huge difference in a lot of different contexts to how people interact with you. Yet it's not actually, in many contexts, it plays a larger role in how you're treated than, say, your race. Nevertheless, it's not discussed as a case. I mean, there is discussion, of course, about lookism and discrimination based on your appearance, but it's not something that receives anyway near the same attention as paradigmatic forms of discrimination like gender and race discrimination.
Right. Okay. I do want to talk about some of the types of discrimination, that we can get to some of the accounts of wrongful discrimination and where you go from there. So just on the difference between, you bring up this difference between direct and indirect discrimination. Could you briefly go over that and like why that might be relevant?
Yeah, so basically the idea is that direct discrimination or disparate treatment are cases where the discriminator treats people differently based on their social group membership, if we go for this social group notion of discrimination. So in order to engage in direct discrimination against women, for instance, the discriminator has to represent the person whom the discriminator discriminates against as a woman. Whereas in the case of indirect discrimination or disparate impact, that's not required. Rather, it's actually required that discriminator treats people in the same way, whether or not they represent them as being women. It's just that treating people in this way has differential effects on people, whether they are women or men. So you could have, say, you could imagine a test which is in no way refers to the gender of the test taker, but it's just designed in such a way that, say, women will be, let's suppose, more disposed to pass the test than men. So in that sense, it might have disparate impact on men because the test, for some reason, test skills which women have to a higher degree than men have. And then the question is, if you ask whether this is indirect discrimination or disparate impact, then the further question you have to ask is whether the disadvantageous effect on men in this case are disproportionate relative to the benefits of actually having the test in question. And if they are disproportionate, say because you could easily use a different test which would give you the best qualified candidates, but without having this gender imbalance, then perhaps you could consider this a case of indirect discrimination or disparate impact.
Right. I did a potential worry about the indirect discrimination category. Like, well, I could imagine someone saying, how is that even a form of discrimination at all? Right? Since you don't have the relevant sort of differential treatment. All you have is differential effects of the treatment. But if discrimination is based on differential treatment, then it's still not discrimination. Do you see what I'm saying there? What do you think about that?
I mean, this is not just something that some people could say. That's something that some people actually do say. So Benjamin Idelson, for instance, in his book on discrimination, actually takes a position like that. And there are other theorists as well. John Gardner did that as well. So this is a real challenge. And you might ask, what's the benefit from thinking about those practices which would fall under the definition of indirect discrimination as cases of discrimination, like those cases that fall under the definition of direct discrimination. And as I see it, probably we could simply stop referring to both sorts of treatment as instances of discrimination. We might then have to use a different term. So suppose we reserve the term discrimination for direct discrimination, we would then have to invent or coin a different term to refer to cases of indirect discrimination. I guess the best explanation of why it's common to think about direct and indirect discrimination under the same hat, the hat of discrimination, is the historical fact that it quite quickly turned out, once states started to implement direct discrimination laws, that they were actually quite ineffective in addressing some of the inequalities that those discrimination laws was meant to address. So in a US context, the classical Duke Powers case, where a company was convicted for discrimination because its promotion rules were such that in order to get promoted, you would have to have a high school degree and you would have had to have a high school degree and have worked in the company for quite a number of years. So these were race neutral rules in the sense that they didn't refer to the race of the person the person applying for promotion. But as a matter of fact, very few African Americans qualified for promotion because, due to past racism, they had been prevented from having a high school degree, and also it was only recently that Duke Powers had started employing African American employees, and so basically you had a situation where direct discrimination laws did not really address the sort of race disparity that people had hoped that direct discrimination laws would do something about. And then came this notion of indirect discrimination, which was probably not part of the concept from the beginning.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this. Yeah, I mean, it does seem fair to say that, I mean, there's something, maybe it's not some of the prototypical or like cases, but it still seems like there's something like discrimination going on there in many of these cases anyway.
I think in many of those cases, probably there is a suspicion that what's going on is what some would call second order discrimination. So really, Duke Powers didn't want to promote African American employees. They realized that they couldn't do that on the basis of their race. Then they came up with these race-blind promotion rules, which in effect gave them the outcome that they wanted. So even if the rules they applied were race neutral, the underlying intention, and that's why it's called second order discrimination, was basically to exclude African American employees from promotion. So I mean, that might be one reason why there is this suspicion that in many of those cases, what's really going on is some form of direct discrimination or not. I don't know if that was the sort of hunch you had.
Yeah, maybe. I might have to think about that more. But then you also talk about statistical discrimination, and on that, like, people are treated differently based on some kind of like a proxy trait, like race, that's statistically correlated with some other trait. We might call it a target trait, for example, criminality. Yeah. Could you explain this sense of, or sort of, discrimination a bit more?
So in the economics literature, it's quite common to distinguish between taste-based discrimination versus statistical discrimination, and the idea here is that an employer who engages in taste-based discrimination is an employer who has a preference for, say, not hiring people with a particular trait. So the employer simply experiences a utility loss by hiring an employee with a particular race or gender. So that's not the case in statistical discrimination, because here the employer is indifferent regarding the employee's race or gender. It's just the case that race or gender is, as you put it, a proxy for the target trait that does interest the employer, and that could be, say, propensity to request parental leave, or it could be absenteeism, and the employer could have the idea that that race and gender are proxies for those target properties, and that for that reason be less inclined to hire, say, a female applicant than a male applicant. And one way to bring out this difference would be to suppose that the employer has a female applicant, and the female applicant is able to supply information which indicates that this particular female applicant differs from her reference group in the sense that, say, she might be 50 years old and unlikely to ask for parental leave. And if the employer in that case is in no way disposed to not hire her instead of a male applicant, then that indicates that the discrimination in question is not taste-based, but statistically based.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. I mean, I just want to make sure I get this correct, though, because thinking about this, it seems to me that, and I think you indicate something along these lines, it's not really a totally different category of discrimination. Like, because for statistical discrimination, it seems like it really would be either direct or indirect discrimination, maybe just with a further story for why they're discriminating or something like that. It's like a subspecies, or perhaps of those more general forms of discrimination. Would you agree to that, or am I not thinking about that right?
So, I mean, probably most cases of statistical discrimination are cases of direct discrimination. You could imagine cases of statistical discrimination against certain groups of people, which are indirect discrimination, but those are, I would imagine, quite rare. So you could imagine, say, you could imagine an employer initiating a particular application procedure where the employer is unaware of what are the relevant statistical proxies for the target property, and therefore unaware about which groups actually are disadvantaged by initiating this procedure. So the employer has a computer, just feeds the computer a lot of information about applicants, and then not having any idea about how feeding the computer affects who actually get employed. This employer ends up, say, hiring disproportionately many people with a particular racial background. So this could be a case of indirect discrimination, indirect statistical discrimination, insofar as the computer engages in statistical discrimination.
Right. Fair enough. And then you also cover structural discrimination. Could you briefly explain structural discrimination and why that's is a form of discrimination and not just like an effect of discrimination? I could imagine someone saying that.
So the way I define structural discrimination is a group inequality, which is a result of social structures, where those social structures are reproduced, at least also through many acts of direct or indirect discrimination. So the point of saying that is that structural discrimination, the distinction between structural and non-structural discrimination is drawn in a different logical space from the distinction between direct and indirect discrimination. So one difference is that in the case of in the case of direct and indirect discrimination, there's always an agent who performs the discrimination, whereas in the case of structural discrimination, there's no agent in that sense. It might be true that structural discrimination always involves agents who engage in direct or indirect discrimination, but there's no agent who performs the structural discrimination as such. At some point I thought that of structural discrimination as a particular systematic form of indirect discrimination, but I think that's actually a mistake. I think one should think of it, the distinction between structural and non-structural discrimination, as simply drawn in a way which crisscrosses with the distinction between direct and indirect discrimination.
Yeah. But you still do think that it's a distinct form of discrimination, to be clear?
Yeah. Oh, that was part of your initial question as well. So I think the benefit of saying that it is a form of discrimination, even if it's neither direct nor indirect discrimination, is to point to the fact that the relevant group inequality is produced through social structures that involve many acts of discrimination. So presumably you could have group inequality which arises without any acts of direct or indirect discrimination. So at least it serves the purpose of enabling us to distinguish between those forms of group inequality which do involve lots of acts of discrimination and those group inequalities that don't. Speaking about a conceptual engineering approach, if we were to use I think it's pretty common nowadays to talk about structural discrimination. It comes up a lot, for instance, in the Me Too debate and in the Black Lives Matter discussion. But I do think probably it wouldn't do any harm to restrict the notion of discrimination to direct discrimination, or perhaps direct and indirect discrimination, and then use a different term for structural discrimination. And actually, many people, more or less interchangeably with the term structural discrimination, talk about structural injustice. And if you simply talked about that, perhaps that would be fine.
Yeah. Okay, good. And I do want to move on to where you start thinking about wrongful discrimination. So just first getting to that, of course, you don't accept the moralized accounts of discrimination. So it's not like built into what discrimination is that it's wrong, or that's not a consequence anyway. But would you say that? I mean, someone could still say that every case of discrimination in the sense that you describe, where is still at least pro tanto wrong. Like at least there's some reason not to do it. Would you agree to that, or what would you say about that view about discrimination? There's at least some reason not to do it in every case.
So one case I typically refer to when something like that is put to me is the case of age discrimination in relation to healthcare services, where I think actually there's a justice-based reason to engage in age discrimination against old people, in the sense that if you have to if you have to prioritize scarce medical resources, giving priority to younger people seems distributively just in the sense that younger people, I mean, almost invariably are unfortunate relative to older people in the sense that they have lived fewer years than older people have. So if you think that there's a requirement of justice to give priority to the worse off, justice would require actually engaging in age discrimination against old people. Of course, not any form of age discrimination, but it would require engaging in the sort of age discrimination that consists in giving priority, at least, to younger people over older people when it comes to scarce medical resources. So to me, that would be an example of a form of discrimination, in this case, age discrimination, which is not even pro tanto wrong.
Yeah, I'm not really. It's not so clear. Because I could imagine someone responding that, well, maybe it is still, maybe that just is a case where it's pro tanto wrong. Like maybe all else equal, it'd be better not discriminate on them this way. But like it's still justified or right to do the discrimination, right? Because there's a competing. I don't know. Maybe it's hard to separate it. Where is it just in all senses? There's no reason not to do it in this case, or is it just there is some reason not to do it, but overwhelming reason to do it? I'm not sure how to think about that. Do you see what I'm saying?
I might. So suppose you have a case. Suppose you have a case where, so you have two people, both of them are starving, and one of them will die unless given food now, and the other person won't die but will still, suffer from starving for some time. And you have some food, and you can give it to only one of them. I think in this case, there's a harm to both of them if you don't give this person the food you have. So in that sense, there's a reason to give the food to the person who won't die if you don't give it to this person, because that would stop the suffering of this person. But it's more important to give it to the person who otherwise will die. And if you do that, I think the fact that you have a reason to give it to the person who is suffering but not under threat of death doesn't suffice to show that it's pro tanto wrong.
Yeah, I guess it makes some sense.
If you say that it's pro tanto wrong, then it's hard to imagine cases that are not pro tanto wrong, right?
Yeah, but if there's at least some reason not to do it, isn't well. I don't know. I'm just thinking. So, like, in some respect, then it's pro tanto wrong, but maybe I'm not thinking about that correctly. I don't know.
Suppose we say that it is pro tanto wrong because there is a reason to give the food to the person who's, in this case, better off. Then I'm just wondering will there ever be a case where whatever you do, you will do something that's pro tanto wrong? If your action has no effect on other people, then perhaps that's the case. But if your action affects other people differentially, then perhaps on this view, your action will always be pro tanto wrong. Does that seem right?
Yeah, that seems plausible to me. And again, maybe I'm not thinking about this correctly, but it seems to me like for the vast majority of our actions, there's like reasons to do it and reasons not to do it, at least. And if if doing something that you have at least some reason not to do is, I mean, those some reasons are like, it's pro tanto wrong in those or with respect to those or something like that, then even if it's like pro toto correct or the right thing to do or the thing that you should do, there's still some pro tanto wrong there, if that makes sense. But I'm not sure that I'm thinking about that correctly.
I'm not sure I am either, but I think at least for some people, suppose that if you open a shop, you will draw customers from another shop in the vicinity, and in that sense, you will harm the other shop owner. So, to me, it seems right to say that you have a reason not to open the shop, but does that suffice to say that it's pro tanto wrong of you to open a shop, or would you say that more has to be the case for the fact that this will harm the other person to be pro tanto wrong? At least if you say no, that's not the case, then I guess the vast majority of actions that we do will be pro tanto wrong. And perhaps you're happy with saying that. I'm just suspecting that many people won't be happy with that implication.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess I was just thinking about pro tanto wrong as just like there's a pro tanto wrong so long as there's some reason not to do it, that it carries some weight like against it. That was my understanding, roughly.
Okay, yeah. But I think at least for the purpose of defining a satisfactory notion of discrimination, if we say that insofar as an act is pro tanto wrong, in the sense that we have a more reason not to perform it, then perhaps a satisfactory definition of discrimination will not just have to satisfy the requirement that discrimination as defined is something where there is some tight connection to pro tanto wrongness. Probably the requirement will have to be stronger than that. I mean, perhaps the requirement should then be something like that. It's reasonable to, if discrimination is defined in this way, then it's reasonable to expect that, say, a significant proportion of cases that qualify as discrimination in this sense will be, all things considered, wrong or something like that.
Yeah, that could be developed further, something along that lines. I'm not sure.
Yeah, probably that's much too strong. But I think at least we will have to say something stronger than just that. It's reasonable to expect that discrimination defined in this way will be pro tanto wrong, because it seems to me that basically any definition will satisfy this requirement. So if we're aiming to define discrimination in the way that people who complain about discrimination think about discrimination, the requirement has to be stronger than just that the definition implies that there's a reason against what counts as discrimination according to the definition, or at least so I would assume.
Right. Yeah. Okay, and then we should cover some of the accounts of the wrongfulness, or what makes wrongful discrimination wrong, and the strengths and weaknesses. So you talk about the or harm-based accounts. So on those views, discrimination is wrongful, or at least wrongful discrimination is wrongful because it harms the person or group that's discriminated, the discriminatee, I guess. So could you expand on that sense of the wrongfulness of discrimination, and maybe what some of the concerns are for it?
I mean, I think at least there's one consideration which speaks in favor of a harm-based account of the wrongfulness of discrimination, which is that when people complain about discrimination, they typically also point to some ways in which they've been harmed by the discrimination in question. So it would be rare for people to complain about discrimination, but then add that as a matter of fact, they benefited from the discrimination they were subjected to, or at least their interests weren't set back. So I think that's an attractive feature of a harm-based account of the wrongfulness of discrimination. But of course, there are other accounts. So in the book, I discuss respect-based accounts and relational equality-based accounts. And the interesting thing here is that you can describe cases where, presumably, perhaps depending a bit on how narrow your account of harm is, you can have cases of discrimination which are harmless or not harmful, but might be considered disrespectful or incompatible with equality of social relations. And then the question is, what should you say about those cases? And I suggest in the book that actually for all three cases, you can imagine cases of discrimination that intuitively seem wrongful in some way, but nevertheless they're not captured by these three accounts. And basically, I think of those three accounts as not the only accounts out there. I mean, basically there are lots of other accounts of what makes discrimination wrongful, but probably in the recent literature, those are the most influential accounts.
Right. Yeah. One of the cases I liked that seems to present a problem for harm-based accounts is like, well, what if they discriminate against them, like the university admissions person, but like reduce the harm by like getting them in somewhere else? That could still be a sort of wrongful discrimination where they're not ultimately harmed, or maybe even harmed at all. Maybe they don't even know about it. So which would undermine, which would seem to be a counterexample to a harm-based account, because it's still wrong, but it didn't involve harm, and so it's not wrong because of the harm or something like that.
I mean, of course, one response to that particular case would be to try to play around with the notion of harm. So you could say that you are in some way harmed if people treat you in a disrespectful way. But of course, if you go that way, it becomes difficult to separate a respect-based and a harm-based account from each other. Because it would seem that in that case, it follows that by definition, if you're subjected to some form of disrespect, it follows that you're also harmed.
Right. Yeah. It could get tricky, I guess. And then for, as you mentioned, like respect-based accounts, basically there's, a certain respect that people should be given as members of some salient group or something like that. Or maybe you don't need to add that in. It's kind of like appropriate treatment or behavior, and then not giving them that behavior is that's what contributes to the wrongfulness of discrimination, or what makes it wrong in cases where you do that. Maybe I'm not explaining it very well, but So what do you think about those accounts, I guess, of discrimination, or the wrongfulness of discrimination?
So, I mean, I think intuitively they are appealing in the sense that it does seem as if when people complain about discrimination, often what they immediately complain about is some form of disrespect. But of course, respect is a slippery notion, so we need a more precise account of what exactly it is to respect or disrespect people, to know whether respect is what really explains the wrongfulness of discrimination. And people can give actually quite different accounts of what disrespect involves is given in the literature on the wrongfulness of discrimination. So in the book, I mentioned three different accounts. So one account says that you disrespect people if you treat them badly on the basis of a false belief about the moral status. So here, disrespect is a matter of treating on the basis of a false belief. But then others suggest that disrespect is a matter of treating people in a way which has a cultural meaning of being disrespectful or actually being demeaning. So that's Debbie Hellman's account. And the third account says that disrespect is a matter of how you deliberate about people in your deliberations about how to treat them. So these are three quite different accounts of disrespect, and you could easily imagine them coming apart, such that an act that would qualify as disrespectful on one of these three accounts would not qualify as disrespectful on the two other accounts. And actually, I also think that for each of the three accounts, you can describe cases where intuitively you would consider a case of discrimination wrongful, even if it's not disrespectful on either of these three accounts. So I think just like you can give counterexamples to the harm-based account, you can also give counterexamples to the disrespect-based account of the wrongfulness of discrimination. So to take just one example, so I think Debbie Hellman's case of or Debbie Hellman's suggestion about wrongful discrimination being demeaning in virtue of its cultural meaning. One implication of that would be to say that one way to address wrongful discrimination is simply to change the cultural meaning of certain forms of treatment. Of course, that will typically be quite difficult to do, but if we could socially engineer social meanings, then we could basically continue acting in the way we do, but then stop engaging in disrespectful discrimination. But I would suspect that intuitively we would say that in many of those cases where we have discriminatory actions that are demeaning, the way to go forward is not by simply changing the social meaning of the acts, but rather than by stop performing those acts.
Yeah, actually, that did remind me of something I was thinking about asking earlier, which is sort of as an aside. To what degree do you think, like, the intent of the discriminator matters to whether it's A, discrimination, and B, whether it's wrongful discrimination? Like, could someone totally unintentionally wrongfully discriminate against somebody, or not? Or does the intent matter only in the sense of how severe the wrongful discrimination is?
So I think my inclination would be to say that it's not a necessary condition for something being discrimination that a particular intent is in place. So, I mean, insofar as there is such a thing as indirect discrimination, that establishes that point. But also, even if we're talking about direct discrimination, if we talk about implicit bias discrimination, presumably that doesn't involve any intent to disadvantage those whom you discriminate against. Actually, it might even go hand in hand with an intention to advantage those people whom you engage in implicit bias discrimination against. So it's not a necessary condition for something being discrimination, but you also wanted me to speak to whether how it affects the moral qualities of acts of discrimination. And there I'm more sympathetic to the view that somehow the presence of a particular intention is something that affects the moral quality of an act of discrimination. So certain kinds of intentions do seem to make acts of discrimination worse than otherwise they would have been.
Yeah, that seems right to me. And then as we move on to the other count of the wrongfulness of discrimination that you cover, which is like social equality accounts, and on those, look, we sort of should be treating each other as equals in some sense, and discrimination is wrong because it violates that norm or something along those lines. So maybe you could explain that a bit more, and how do you approach that sort of view about the wrongfulness of discrimination?
So that's a view which has been most prominently defended by the Canadian philosopher Sophia Moreau, and basically, I think it's an appealing account in the sense that a lot of cases of discrimination that would figure most prominently in discussions are cases where discrimination is part of a larger pattern of social actions which contributes to subordination of particular groups. So think about race discrimination in South Africa under apartheid. Definitely racial discrimination in that society meant that blacks and whites didn't relate as equals in that society, and that does seem to be part of what made apartheid such a horrendous political system as it was. I think, though, that once one starts looking more closely at this account, at least a number of big questions arise. And one big question, I think, is the phrase treating each other as equals needs to be fleshed out in various ways. So, and the most obvious way is that you will need some account of the respects in which you should treat each other as equals. It's not possible. I mean, if I'm giving the instruction, treat this person as an equal, I wouldn't know what to do before I'm told in what respect I'm supposed to treat this person as an equal. And here there are at least two obvious answers, and one is that you should treat people as social equals. Alternatively, you should treat people as moral equals. And I think that's a distinction that hasn't been examined enough in the literature on social egalitarianism, in the sense that when it comes to treating people as social equals, it seems that there are many contexts in which it's actually morally permissible, if not morally required, not to treat people as social equals. I mean, there are social hierarchies which are, local social hierarchies that are justified in the sense that we would actually all be worse off if we didn't allow them. So the requirement can't be that we are social equals. But then you might ask, but couldn't the requirement just be that we treat each other as moral equals? But I think that, first of all, you could imagine cases where we would actually benefit everyone by not treating all of us as moral equals. And then it's not always clear to me that in those cases it would be morally wrong not to treat us as moral equals. And also, I think there are cases of wrongful discrimination where you might say this is wrongful discrimination, but it's not a matter of not treating people as moral equals. So everyday sexist acts where you treat men and women differently, but it would be an exaggeration to say that those everyday sexist acts are a matter of treating men and women as if they have different moral status. Might count as wrongful discrimination, even if not, it's not a matter of not relating as moral equals. And I actually also discussed this case of what I call the something Greek polis, so which is an imaginary case where people are treated as unequals or inferiors in virtue of having a particular gender and in virtue of having a particular religion. But it so happens that all those people who have the inferior religion have the superior gender, and all those people who have the inferior gender have the superior religion. I suppose that these two factors are equally important, such that all individuals are treated as equals, even if it's also the case that for any individual, this individual is treated as having a lower moral status or social status in virtue of this, either this person's religion or in virtue of this person's gender. And it seems to me that there's something which we might object to going on in this case, even if it can't be a matter of people not relating as individuals. And what's objectionable is simply that a feature which shouldn't affect or doesn't affect people's moral status or social status, or shouldn't affect it, is treated as being significant.
Yeah. So without we could talk more about these particular accounts of the wrongfulness of discrimination, but like just broadly, although there's some things going for each of them, there's also some serious concerns for each of them by your lights anyway. Do you think there's much prospects for a sort of single or kind of monistic account of the wrongfulness of discrimination, or probably there's nothing so simple that will be forthcoming? Or what do you think? I know you get this towards the end of the book, but
so personally, I've probably been more optimistic regarding a monist account in previous work than I am now. I think if we just go to normative ethics, and so not focusing on discrimination in particular, but just ask what's the prospect for a monist account of the moral status of actions. I think probably a monist view is a minority view, and actually, I think it's difficult to see why an account of the wrongfulness of discrimination should not mirror the pluralism of the best account of what makes actions morally wrong in general.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that actually seems exactly right to me. Like when I think about like normative ethics broadly, like I mean, terms like wrong and what you should and should do. Well, first of all, these get used in different and somewhat messy ways, but it seems to me that like the track certain sorts of things and certain paradigm cases and so on in complex and messy ways that I don't think will admit of some like, well, here's the feature that's a relatively simple feature that's like distinctive of all the morally wrong cases or whatever. I just don't think we're going to get something like that. And I agree that I would expect that too also of in more specific domains of wrongful actions like wrongful discrimination. I mean, maybe that's wrong on both counts, but that seems very plausible to me. Without getting into more detail there at this point, anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I should add though that I think it would be nice if we could propose a monistic account that actually would explain why these different factors all seem to make actions or acts of discrimination wrong. But I just don't think that we are there now and have been there for quite some time, despite many attempts to propose a monistic account of wrongfulness of actions.
Right. Fair enough. I did. There's some other stuff in the book. Well, obviously we haven't gone to that much detail on some of the stuff that we discussed, but there's other stuff in the book that I haven't asked about. Probably skip for now. I mean, you mentioned some of the implicit biases and maybe subconscious discrimination or something like that, as well as, and then we haven't talked at all about AI and stuff related to that, discrimination related to that. But I do recommend people check out the element if you want to see more about that and all the stuff we've been discussing. It's worth looking into. But yeah, I do normally end with kind of meta philosophical question, if that's all right. What do you think is the value of philosophy? I know it's a broad question, but like maybe you can make it more specific if you want. Like, why do you think philosophy is worth doing? Maybe for you or generally in society.
So if I could ask, if I could start specifically with what's the value of philosophizing about discrimination?
Yeah, that's good.
Then that's a question which I ask myself from time to time. Probably not as often as I ought to do, but and one reason why one might suspect that the answer is negative in the sense that it hasn't much value is, of course, that it seems that it's very difficult to get consensus on many of the philosophical questions we might ask about discrimination. So people disagree about whether, conceptually speaking, discrimination requires a comparator or not. People disagree about, as we talked about, what makes discrimination wrongful. Some people are monists, other people are not. But among pluralists, there are different accounts of what are the wrongful making features of discrimination. And I suspect that 50 years from now, we are probably in a similar situation. So one might ask, what's the point? But I think actually there is a point, even if there isn't much progress, in the sense that we end up having a consensus about some of these central questions, which is that along the way we learn things, we learn about views that don't work, we uncover distinctions which are important but which we mightn't have been aware of, we clear up confusions. So in that sense, I think it can have a negative point of engaging in philosophizing about discrimination, even if it doesn't result in people getting to a consensus about what are the correct answers to central philosophical questions about discrimination. And that might make philosophy different from perhaps some other disciplines, especially in the sciences, where some questions are asked, and then after a while they are closed, in the sense that virtually everyone agrees what the right answers are, and we don't see much of that in philosophy. Which is not to, one shouldn't either exaggerate about the extent of consensus in sciences, and especially not when issues in sciences have political significance, as some issues in philosophy have. So this is the way I would think about the value of philosophizing about discrimination, but I think this probably generalizes to a lot of other philosophical questions. This thing about learning along the way, learning negative lessons, even if that doesn't result in a consensus among philosophers about the right answers to philosophical questions. And of course, philosophical questions are very important questions, and lots of people think hard about them. And I think that gives it value to, that gives philosophy value in itself.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I definitely agree with that. But yeah, I think I'll end the questions there. But it's been really really great having you, Professor Rasmussen, and first of all, you writing this book and or Element, and you getting a chance to look at it and taking my questions and having conversations. It's been really great having you.
Well, thanks a lot. Pleasure to talk with you.